Barbara Arauco discusses her latest book, Elsie at Ebb Tide, Emerging from the Undertow of Alzheimer's.
My mother had Alzheimer's, and it's a very scary disease. You feel quite alone out there as a caretaker.
I understand. It really is a difficult topic.
You know, Barbara, most people don't want to read a book about Alzheimer's.
Let me share a story from the book. My sister, my mother, and I were shopping at the mall, and we got hungry. And Mom was confused now, so we knew she couldn't pick out food from the eatery. So we decided on Pepsi and pizza. So we got in line and ordered it. We got a table, sat down. Mom crunched her little teeth into her pizza, and she said, "Oh my goodness, I've never had this before. What is it?" And Sandra and I looked at each other disheartened because when we were kids, Mom used to buy stacks of pizza shells, the cheap pizza shells and tomato sauce and grated cheese, and we had it all the time. And now it was slid off of her memory. And we were kind of wondering what would happen when she tasted the Pepsi. Well, she drank the Pepsi and, "Oh, this tastes so good. I've never had this before. What is it?" And oh boy, there went all the soft drinks from our youth. So we were kind of disheartened at the time. But I look at it back on that moment now, and I realize that, there's a lot of people that say they only can find God in the present moment. And Sandra and I weren't in the present moment. We were talking about what we just bought. We talked about what we were going to do after lunch. The only one that was living in the present moment was my mother. She had all the exit routes blocked. The only space she could be in was the present moment. And she was eating the pizza with just complete joy. And, this really began to change my whole thinking about this. And I wrote about it in my book. And here's what I want to say. Without memory loss, we'll never get another experience of that type of awe and innocence. Our culture defines Alzheimer's as a disease. The thought of memory loss, of losing our identity, unsettles us so much that we fail to see any hidden gifts at all. We assume there are none. Yet here is my mother, on this sunny afternoon, in this ordinary mall, on this ordinary day, eating ordinary food, and to her, it is an amazing and unforgettable experience.
After reading your book, I realized your mother was quite an accomplished woman.
Well, yeah, she did have a pretty amazing job. Though as a kid, I didn't completely recognize that. She was a protocol officer in the State Department, and she worked under 3 administrations, the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. Now, her job was to help the White House in coordinating all of the details for an official visit. What she liked the most, though, was the funny things, when things didn't go quite right. Now, one of her jobs was to hold the flowers that would be given to the First Lady, who in turn would give them to the wife of the visiting dignitary. On one occasion, this was Lady Bird Johnson. The flowers were always long-stemmed red roses. Mom and Lady Bird are standing on the White House lawn waiting for the helicopter to land. The helicopter comes down. Of course, the blades are beating a great wind. So Mom looked down at the flowers, and to her absolute shock, there were no petals. And she looked up, and there they were, hundreds of them floating across the White House lawn. So she turned to Lady Bird and handed her probably the first official White House bouquet of stems.
She certainly had an interesting life, but who took care of you while she was doing all this traveling?
Dad, he was an independent carpenter. And when Mom got this job, he looked at her and he said, "Elsie, you've got the best damn job in the world. I'll take care of the kids." And he did. We learned how to shoot bows and arrows. We learned to play baseball. We did all kinds of manly sort of things, fishing and all that stuff. He was a great dad. And Mom could not have had that job without my father.
Well, I know you were your mother's care manager for 13 years. And based on my mother's experience, I know it had to get tougher as you went along.
It did get harder in some respects, but I was fortunate in two ways that I want to make really clear. Mom's personality didn't change. So she didn't throw plates at me, she didn't cuss, she just slowly faded away. That was an important feature. The other thing, too, is that she had had a good job in the government, so she had a good pension and she had the rent from her house, and we were able to use those funds to manage her care. So I was her care manager, and that makes a big difference. I do know that some people are in the trenches with children and jobs and parents with Alzheimer's, and it's extremely difficult, and I'm extremely sympathetic to that. So Mom's journey began in assisted care in Florida, but I had to bring her to Maryland eventually so I could manage her care. Eventually she fell and broke her hip. This is very typical of people with Alzheimer's and osteoporosis. The doctor said she probably wouldn't live more than a year. And I went into the rehab room, and it was a dark room. There was a bowl of cold oatmeal next to her. Her head was hanging off the side of the bed. I just thought she won't live a month. And I said, she's coming home. I'm bringing her home. And I tore my house apart in 2 weeks and turned it into a home care facility. And in came Mom. And I had hired a caregiver, Howa. And so we became a family of 3. Now, Mom, by this time, was in the 11th year of her disease. So she was bedridden. She mostly babbled. She would say yes, no, thank you. Sometimes she'd come out of the murk and say, half sentences or certain things. So that was what life was like. She especially liked it when I played the piano because she taught me to play the piano. So now I played the same pieces that she taught me. She loved it. And she would get next to me on the keyboard and she'd slap her hands up and down, slapping the keys. And it was a really happy time. If Mom hadn't been living with me, I doubt I would have ever seen some of the things that I did see. It was the fact I was with her 24/7. I was able to walk into the room anytime I wanted and just sit with her and just kind of chat, even though she was incoherent, most of the time. So here's what happened in the beginning. She would start gesturing across the room, pointing, and she would be talking to, it appeared to be somebody. Of course, there was nobody there. And she'd give a name if I'd say, or I'd just hear her say a name. It might be Mary or Edith or somebody else. And what I noticed was that in every single case, that person was deceased. She never had an invisible conversation with her sister Alice, who was still living, or my sister Sandra, who was still living. And I just thought, okay, she's kind of in, a daydreamy kind of world. She's just remembering good old days, and, I didn't think too much of it. But then, one day, she pointed across the room and she said, "There's Eddie." By this time, I just said, "Hi, Eddie." And then she pointed to the space next to Eddie and she said, "There's Wayne." And I thought, whoa, because Eddie was my father's best friend, and we all knew when he died. My mother was of sound mind and healthy, so she knew he had died. But we never told her his son Wayne had died. Wayne was only 40 years old, and he died of a stroke. So here she was adamantly pointing to Wayne, and a little frustrated with me that I wasn't noticing it. Now, the interesting thing was she picked only the 2 people in that family who had died. She didn't point to anyone that was still living. It kind of felt like I have my jigsaw puzzle the way I look at Alzheimer's. All my pieces are in their proper places, and that's the way I look at this disease. And now these pieces are coming into my hands that belong to the picture, but there's no place to put them. But I didn't pay much attention again. I just kind of thought, oh, that's unusual. And then time went on. Then one day, it was a Monday afternoon, I remember it as clear as a bell. Mom came out of her Merc after her afternoon nap, and she said, I can't stop him. He won't listen to me. Clear as a bell. And Howa, who the caregiver, said, who? And she said, my brother. And back down into her murky world. 24 hours later, I get a call from my cousin telling us that Mom's brother, Swanty, had died on Monday. Now, I have AT&T, I have email, I have my cell phone. My mother, whose mind is functioning at presumably zero, according to the medical reports, is telling me her brother has died. I held on to that piece of the puzzle a long time because I didn't know what to do with it. But I still did nothing. It's just I was confused. I didn't know how Alzheimer's could work this way because things were happening that didn't fit my picture of the disease. More time passed. I walked into Mom's room one day, and her face was a constellation of terror. Now, I've known my mother since I was born, and I have never seen that facial expression, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know whether to call 911. I didn't know if she was an emotional nightmare with the Alzheimer's. I just didn't know what to do. But that's when I made my leap. I had a friend who was a medical intuitive. Her name was Kenna. I'd known her a long time. I was desperate. I called her up and I said, Kenna, can you connect telepathically with my mother and find out what's going on? I don't know what to do. She did. She called me back in half an hour later and she said, your mother was just lost between the world of the physical and the world of the spirit. And she said, I just explained to her where she was and how to be in that space.
I don't understand that term medical intuitive. What did you mean by that?
It's a person who has telepathic abilities, psychic abilities, and in Kenna's case, someone who's trained, she went through 4 years of rigorous training to specifically look at medical issues in people and emotional disorders. So that's her specialty, that's her niche. The other way I explain it is we think, oh, well, we're not telepathic, but in a way all of us are, because how would we ever recognize love? I mean, love is not a chair, it's not a table, it's not a kitchen utensil, and yet we're absolutely certain we know love. So we do have some abilities, we just don't quite think this way. My mom calmed down, her face was peaceful, it actually even had a little smile on it. I called my sister, and this is kind of funny because my sister is an electrical engineer. I used to design information systems. My father thought Einstein was one step short of God. My mother was a protocol officer who organized everything in sight. I mean, we were all head people. We were the most head people in the world. But I said, Sandra, I said, what if we have Kenna keep connecting with Mom? Because after all, if it's working, it'd be helpful for Mom. And Sandra said, yeah, let's do that. So that's how it began. And we had Kenna connect regularly with Mom. And I kept the transcripts. I take shorthand. So everything that was said, I took down. Kenna didn't know Mom. Mom didn't know Kenna. But Mom slowly shared her life. She said how she loved dancing, how she loved music. She liked to fly in airplanes, but Herbie, her husband, didn't. He preferred being on boats. This is all true. And so we went on this way until the last days of her life. At this point, my sister Sandra and I talked frequently, almost every day. And I just kept getting this strong feeling that Mom needed to see my sister. Sandra lived 3,000 miles away. I'm in Maryland, she's in Seattle area. And she was raising 2 boys in a full-time job. So she could only make quick trips like twice a year to see Mom for a few days. But I just kept feeling that Mom needed to be with her firstborn child before she could ever say goodbye or want to say goodbye. So Sandra and I talked it back and forth, and we found a creative way to get Elsie all the way 3,000 miles to Seattle. So that happened, and that broke the chain of my care. I had been taking care of her now for over 12 years. And it was hard for me. You know, you have like a baby monitor that's on all the time to your mother when in a situation like this. It never goes off. And so now Sandra was the caregiver, and then she was seeing Mom every day, and I was getting the reports. Then Mom went into serious decline. But before that happened, I did get to see her one last time. I went in to see, I got the 3,000 miles I took, it was a road trip, and I got there and I went in to see her and I cried. I was so happy to see her. But then I had to leave, and that just absolutely tore me up because I thought, chances are I'll never see her alive again. And I went in and I took her, I kneeled in front of her, she was in her wheelchair, and I put my hands on her arms and I looked in her eyes. And I was just in tears again. But when I looked at her, it was, you know, I was looking through her into spirit, into the other side, into unconditional love. I've never seen anything like it. There was love pouring out of her that was beyond any human love. It was as though she was now all spirit, barely tethered in a body. And all the human ego stuff has gone. And all I'm seeing is this radiant, amazing, overwhelming love just pouring in waves out of her over me. I really didn't know what to make of it. I think of a baby, and a baby has an innocent, beautiful, wide gaze. But this was different. This was after a woman who's lived a full life. And she's spirit. And I'm seeing what she sees. I'm seeing where she lives now. Well, I kept crying, but I laughed. About 6 weeks later, I got a call from my sister saying that they were on their way to the emergency room. Mom had severe abdominal pain. I right away hung up, got on the phone with Kenna. I said, Kenna, can you connect with my mother? Mom was dying so fast that the doctors didn't even have time to admit her to the hospital. They asked me if I wanted to use Herculean measures to keep her alive. I said, can you keep her alive till I get there? And they said, we'd have to use heroic measures. And I said, no, we always promise Mom, oh, happy death. So I said, no, let her go. And I had Kenna connect with Mom. And I want to read what Mom said. This is my mother right down to her toenails. This is the way, she's very pithy, so I'll just say what she said. This was her last human words on earth to Kenna. And she said, I sure am not going to hang around in a lot of pain. I will tell you that. I won't put up with this nonsense. All this coming and going. I want to rest. No wonder people die. To get some rest. So I decided to write a book about my mother. And I was already out on a limb because I'd worked with Kenna and my mom. And I thought, well, why not chop that limb right off? I think I'll ask 5 psychics to interview my mother and ask her 2 questions. The first one would be, what was her experience of Alzheimer's from the inside out? And the second would be, what would she want caregivers to know? Now, I found 5 psychics. They were in Oregon, Florida, Arizona, Maryland, and London. They didn't know each other, they didn't know my mother, and they took no money. So during that first stage, she was angry, frustrated, frightened, scared. She said the same things to everyone. And I think that's when we see a lot of acting out from Alzheimer's. That's when they're angry, they're accusing you of stealing and things like that. Then she entered an intermediate stage, which she said words like the fog, the void, the emptiness. That was when I think I saw her face looking so terrified, and that's the moment I called Kenna And Kenneth started to build a bridge for her between this world and the world that she was going to, the spirit world. During the advanced stages, the very last year and a half of her life, that's when I noticed the shooting star moments when she was crossing over. So now, of course, the psychics were interviewing Elsie and asking her to talk about that part too. And here I want to use her words in particular. She said first to one of them, "I lost touch with communication on the earth plane, but on the other side all could be understood without the use of vocal cords. There was a language, so language is used, but so much is understood at a higher level." Eventually, she preferred that world. She says, "Those around me in the physical world would make well-intentioned attempts to bring me back to the present, but that became intrusive. I had landed in the other reality very safely, and that became more familiar to me. I felt a little bit less safe when jarred out of that, perhaps by someone speaking to me or taking care of my physical needs." And I think that's when we see them sleeping so much. That would be the phase that I think that she was in now. She really was living on the other side in that regard. And she said to one other person, "The soul knows that it cannot get out of the physical body. The soul is blocked off, and therefore it tends to cross over. It's almost like there's just natural drawing over that happens, like a slow birthing process. It's just organic and it's just natural. Of course, it does not cross over completely because it's still tied to the physical body, but it is trying to escape something it knows it cannot fight. So there's a natural pulling over, and the soul is just fine." So there's very reassuring words. Now, she had two pieces of advice for caregivers. One is that in the very advanced stages of Alzheimer's, what's most important to the person is gentle touch and soft voice. And the family should not feel guilty. She wanted to reassure them, do not feel guilty if you have to, or it's the right thing to put them in a nursing care facility. Just pick a good facility, but understand that, the person is going to be fine. Their needs at this point are no longer to have you recognize them. They just need soft touch and gentle voices. The other thing she said really intrigued me, I think, almost more than anything. She said, if there's unfinished business between you, maybe there were some hot spots, some things that just never quite worked right. She said, now's the time for you to tell the person who is in advanced Alzheimer's and seems like they're not hearing or anything at all. But she said they're already very much in the spirit world. They already see things differently. They already have a greater, more gracious understanding of things. And it's a good time for you to kind of let go of any unfinished business before they totally pass on.
Did she ever say anything about her own death?
Even though I never asked Mom to describe how she died, in every instance with all 5 psychics, she volunteered that information. And she always said it was quick, it was easy, it was like the wish of a bird. But I liked the way she said it to Kenna the best. She said, "The time is right, the opportunity is there, the door flies open, and you better run fast to catch that train." I learned a lot about Alzheimer's through my mother. She was my teacher. She taught me right up to the moment of her last breath and beyond. And I'm terribly grateful to her for that. And what I learned is this. The mind, yes. The brain, yes, is diseased. Yes, it does not work. We all understand that profoundly. But the soul is never diseased. The soul is totally healthy, and the soul will find a way to express itself. The way I look at it is that when we have a sound mind, all our senses work. Our soul is able to communicate itself through our sight, through our voice, through touch. We have a million ways to express our soul energy when the brain is perfectly okay. The problem comes when the brain gets diseased, and the soul will find a way to express itself. So it starts going over to spirit. And that is what I find absolutely incredible, awesome, inspiring, and hopeful.